we go. It's official. We've started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Avid Reader launch this evening for Alison Croggon's creative nonfiction hybrid memoir, I am told, called Monsters. So very excited to have you all along here tonight. Again, thank you to everyone for being agile with our switch over to Zoom. Unfortunately, Alison was supposed to join us in person at Avid tonight. We have had to make the decision, however, to make this a virtual event, but we're going to make this as engaging, and obviously with if for those of you who have been to Avid Reader, to one of our launches in person before, you'll know how intimate the back deck is, and so we'll transport you there tonight, just using your imaginations. Just think of the back deck, the soundscape of West End, the enchanted garden of Bougainvillea that the Avid Reader bookshop is. So we're there. Please make yourselves comfortable, and we'll get underway. So to officially start the event this evening, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners from where I'm coming from, which is Yuggera and Turrbal land in Meanjin or Brisbane. I pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge that this has always been and will always be Aboriginal land and a place of creativity, community and storytelling. So for those of you who are perhaps new to Zoom or haven't been on one of our events before, what will happen, and I just need to duck over for a second and let some more people in, won't be a second. Go. So what will happen is I will post a message in the chat function, so that will pop up. You can then communicate to me if you have any questions through the evening, which I can then relay when we get to Q&A time at approximately 7:15. Our event will go for an hour this evening, so you will have time for lots of questions and some good conversations. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our special guests for this evening. And also to mention, you will be on mute for the duration. Then at the end, we'll be able to give everyone a big round of applause. So joining us tonight, author Alison Croggon is an award-winning novelist, poet, theatre writer, critic and editor who lives in Melbourne. And Alison's conversation partner is Yen-Rong Wong, a writer, essayist, reader, occasional reviewer, knitter, musician and scientist. She is currently based in Meanjin alongside myself in Brisbane on unceded Yuggera and Turrbal land. So I will pass over to you, Yen-Rong, and a very big, warm Avid Reader welcome to you both.
Hi everyone. So my cat is exploring, so she may come in and out of the camera, or you just see her tail. There we go. Alrighty, so we're here to discuss Monsters with Alison Croggon. So Alison, I think maybe we should start with the origin of the idea for the book. Why did you want to write this particular book in this particular way?
Oh, I mean, there's a long version and a short version. I'll try and do a kind of mixture of both of them, a medium version. But the long version is, I mean, this is one of those books that's been kind of, don't distract me with your cat, been kind of bubbling away or for a long time since, I mean, I'm actually wasn't born in Australia. I was born in South Africa, and of British parents who were in South Africa because my father was a miner, and we went back to Cornwall when I was 4 years old, and then came out to Australia when I was 7 and have stayed ever since. And so I come from what I think in my late 20s, early 30s, began to realize this wasn't unusual. This was part of a much larger pattern. For one thing, my father was a Cornish miner. That's a kind of cliche, but I remember him saying to me that you know, when he was a boy, he had two choices. He could inherit the farm or he could become a miner. And he became a miner, which is about kind of, you know, economic imperatives. But as I began to realize, it's also about colonial imperatives. The economy and the colony are both aspects of the same thing. And I suppose that, and on my mother's side, I come from a long, long line of colonists. And this was always something that troubled me and began to increasingly trouble me over the years, with a whole lot of things to do with class and so on and so forth. And this particular, so I've written about this stuff before, actually, but this particular book was sparked by the breakdown of my relationship with my sister, my middle sister, which was something that happened over a period of years, and which when it finally broke down irretrievably, it was, as these things are, incredibly painful, but also threw a kind of light over my life. You know, it was like there's suddenly a new angle of illumination, and that prompted me to think about all these things in another way. And it was kind of like trying to write this book, which I have tried to write before, that links together all the larger patterns with the intimate patterns. And they're all intimate patterns of pain, the larger patterns of pain. How these things, because I've always had this notion or instinct that these things are deeply related, that the dysfunctions of what is, in my case, a fairly, you know, standard middle class English family, how the dysfunctions there actually reflect much larger forces that shape us all. And in our case is very definitely the British Empire, but the British Empire is actually a huge thing that spawned, for example, the American Empire, but has also shaped the entire world, and the geopolitical world we know today has been shaped by the British Empire. So this book is me sitting down going, well, okay, I have a very small kind of letterbox through which I'm looking at this kind of history, but maybe there's something in having a look at that and trying to make those emotional and intimate connections to it as well. Because the other thing that drove it is wanting to understand why change is so difficult to make, and why, especially as white people, we are so resistant to change. And that, to me, goes much deeper than we normally like to think.
Yeah. Do you think that was, so growing up in South Africa, obviously, where the race divide was very, very, very clear.
Yeah.
And then coming, I guess, to Australia, where we try not to talk about it a lot. We try to say we're multicultural and kind of paper over all of the violence that we commit against Indigenous people and people who just don't look the same as I don't know, as like the settlers who came here. Do you think growing up in South Africa and having like seen that race divide kind of gave you more of a perspective on the way race is treated? I know you left there when you were quite young, but
I was 4 when we left. And the thing is that, I mean, it's kind of weird because my childhood memory is so clearly divided. You know, that I have these kind of weird baby memories, and I know they must be when I was younger than 4 because they were in South Africa as opposed to England. So that kind of, they get pinned. They don't run together like memories often do. But what is most striking about being in South Africa, I spoke Afrikaans. I was bilingual when I was a child, but I don't remember any of it now. So it was formative in ways. So, you know, like if I hear a South African accent, it's very familiar. I couldn't possibly imitate it, but I know it somewhere deep in my memory. But what's most striking about that is that race was never talked about. My parents never talked about it. And in the book, I talk about looking at photos of, because we were in South Africa in the 60s, you know, the height of apartheid and Sharpeville, all these terrible things. Never talked about in my family, ever. And looking at pictures of streets we must have walked through in the towns we lived in, and the signs that saying whites only and things like that. I walked in those streets. And so there's an awful lot of denial in that. Like there's, how is that never talked about? It's just assumed we never talk about it. There's an assumption we all make in order for it not to be talked about.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about colonialism as well, there is an unwillingness on the part of especially white people, I guess, to see themselves as part of the colonial project. So you have those people saying, you know, I wasn't here in when the British came, why do I have to apologize?
Oh, exactly.
You know, to Indigenous people and all that sort of stuff. And that, I think, ties into this idea or this obsession that some Australian people have with lineage, in terms of I can trace my ancestors back to the First Fleet, or you know, that just seems sort of absurd to me, to be like, oh yeah, okay, so you're related to people who dispossessed the original people of this country, and you're proud of that. There's this preoccupation with whiteness, maybe, that blinds them to what actually has been going on in this country, and to link it to something that's bigger.
Yeah, that's what whiteness is. And I was very much brought up, my mother came from a fairly aristocratic family, and we, you know, like what relatives who were governor generals in the British Empire, and particularly in India. And so one of the things I did in the book, besides, the book is partly biographical in that it traces my family. I managed to trace some of them back 1,000 years. And when I mean, it was pretty funny. I was sort of just doing some amateur genealogy, but, you know, I managed to get back. I was going the line of easiest resistance, which means that you're tracing people who are recordable. So the further you go back, when you go back that far, there's about something like 8 million possible grandparents you have. So, you know, what does that mean? Except it doesn't mean much kind of in terms of your personal biography, but it does mean something about the myth that's then carried through to the present day. But by the time I got back there, my earliest ancestor I could trace was a colonist from Europe. He went to colonize the Scots and basically put down the rebellious Gaelic tribes. So, and I was like, okay, that's 1,000 years, and there's no, you know, like there's what do you do with that kind of thing? And I suppose one of the things was finding that one of my ancestors, of whom my mother is very proud, he was the one who ended up briefly being Governor General of India, but he was partly in his earlier career, and one of the reasons why he became, you know, promoted afterwards as a young man, he was in the Boer War in South Africa, and he was part of the, I can't remember the name of the guy who ran them, but the person who instituted the concentration camps in the Second Boer War, which were precursors to the notorious Nazi concentration camps. And that was where it was like, oh my God, what do I do with that kind of history in my family that feels so personal? And guilt doesn't seem appropriate I'm not interested in feeling guilty, but I am interested in tracing that and asking, hey, we have a responsibility towards that history that, you know, I have as a person who's English, of English extraction from a privileged English family, but also to look at the ways in which it's been perpetrated and reproduced, and how power is reproduced, and how we hide the obvious from ourselves.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you talk about, you know, the path of least resistance being important people, and they would obviously mostly be men, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, women weren't important enough to be written about. Yeah. And so I find it interesting that you're now a woman looking back at what these men have done and trying to grapple with that sort of stuff in your family. And then also the link between whiteness as violence, and how, you know, whiteness and masculinity as violence, but then how that translates into white feminism, how there are lots of parallels there, because everyone's trying to find a sense of power, right? And the only sort of power that they have seen has been perpetrated by white men. And it's just this cycle that seems to just keep going, and there seems to be no way to sort of break that. Do you think?
I think
no, you go.
I was just going to say, I don't think there is any way to break it. I mean, one of the things that absolutely drives the book is, what does patriarchy and colonialism do to women and to our relationships between women, given that the book is, you know, partly about the breakup of my relationship with my sister, and how we actually learn how in the ways we're educated. I'm talking about white people, and I'm talking, well, you know, we internalize things, so that can include people who are not white, who are educated in our education system. But we, as English people, and I actually was directly raised like this, because home was England. Home, you know, the colonists, and this was true of all my family, went overseas to basically administer the British Empire. And this was up to the 60s, 70s, in various ways, you know, like working for mining companies, or sometimes administration and what was then called Malaya. I remember my uncle talking about Malaya. And then they'd go home with their riches. And the idea was you retired back to Britain. We never went back to England, obviously. My father was kind of, I think he decided he wanted to just live here and get away from all that. But it's through the whole thing is that we English people were basically...
Sorry, my cat's trying to get into a bag, so I'm gonna have to rescue her. 2 seconds.
Just a little cat advertisement. I can hear the cat in the bag. I can think about the complicated thing I'm trying to say. Because I suppose the point about all of this, and the point of the book itself, in fact, is that all of this is so complicated. There's no easy answers to any of this. And there's no, one of the ways, anyway, what I was saying, and that came out of a moment where my grandmother told me I wasn't British. She was very angry with me. We'd had some fight when I was like 15. I was staying with her, and I was the wrong kind of grandchild. And she turned around and just spat at me. You're not British. And I had no idea what she meant. And then I realized I sort of wasn't the right kind of British person, because I wasn't carrying the values of empire into the foreign country, and then, you know, being part of the colonization process that is absolutely inculcated into you. And so therefore I was some kind of traitor. And but I remember puzzling over that for years, because I was objectively British. I had a British passport, all that kind of stuff. Like, what did she mean I wasn't British? And at that point, we'd been living in Australia for quite a while, and I didn't feel particularly Australian either. But so we in order to reproduce empire, we're taught things about how the world works, you know, and they include things like white people are better than other people, and that's why we can have all the things, and men are more important than women and they have the authority, you know. Like, I remember my mother saying things like, you know, men don't like intelligent women, you must never undermine the authority of a man.
My mum said that to me. She was like, you need to find someone at university because boys don't like girls who are smarter than them.
No, exactly. It's terrible. You know, the intersection of patriarchy and that sort of thing, that you have to always be subservient in some way to the authority of the man. You cannot have your own authority, which then leads to all sorts of terribly what's the word, you know, like distorted ideas about power, especially between women, and competition between women, that absolutely destroy relationships between women and trust. And because we internalize these things unless we think about them. And
I find it interesting that you talked about your grandma saying you're not British, as in like relating it to my own culture. Like, to be Chinese is you have all of these kind of ancient traditions that you may or may not follow when you are Chinese, but they're all, you know, related to the festivals, and they're all related to how the languages has been created, and all the characters and all of these like myths that are related to the moon, or, you know, or the new year or whatever. And, you know, that's a rich culture and tradition there. And then you come to British people and it's like, our rich tradition is stealing land from other people. Like, like, I just find that so, and then, like, they're proud of that as well. But I just find it so jarring that,
I mean, you know, like the thing about empire, and you know, one of the things, I mean, there's so many things I'm kind of touching on in that book, but one of them is the kind of emptiness of the idea of whiteness, which goes inevitably with colonization. But at the same time, there is such a richness in, say, European culture. There just is, and it's deep. You know, like, I feel that when I'm there, but I'm very alienated out from it because I've been raised elsewhere and I have relationships elsewhere, and so on and so forth. So truth is, as a global person, I will never quite be at home anywhere, except, you know, with those relationships I make and so on. And I think many of us are like that in this century. But there are things we can claim, and that are our own, that are not, you know, you don't have to kind of steal everything from elsewhere. I mean, all cultures exchange, and that's a source of enormous richness in ways. But exchanges are between equals. It's not something that happens when, you know, as you know, particularly happened in the British Empire. The word loot itself is a Hindu word that the British stole, and you can see it in the English language. And I talk a bit about, because, you know, as a writer, I love the English language. I've always, you know, I've started off as a poet, and I love the language. I love the tradition. I love the literature. And of course, even when I was little, and I talk, you know, about like children's books, you know, reading as a girl between the lines, because the boys were never heroes. You know, I wanted to be a boy. The girls were never heroes. You know, the boys got to be kings and wave swords around and all that kind of stuff, and girls never did. And, you know, and how racialized books, you know, children's books in English language really are. It's something else.
Even now.
Yeah, absolutely. But going all the way back. So all these things are charged and difficult, but there's still, you know, like there's the reaction of many people, I think, is guilt, which I don't see a lot of point in, and B, the kind of extreme reactions where you see it seems so common in academia, where people they pretend to be Latina or Black, and they're not at all. There's been so many cases like that. Or Rachel Dolezal, which is something I talk about in the book, where the impulse is just to throw off your entire kind of heritage because it's tainted and it's horrible and it's full of violence, especially if you experience it as violence as a child. Because one of the things that I wanted to actually identify in the book was that in order for this thing to perpetuate itself, we do first to each other, kind of willingly, what we then do to others' bodies. And we learn, you know, like in boarding school, kids learn how to be cruel, and they're treated cruelly. And this is, you know, family history, but like my father was sent to boarding school when he was 4. And that's a very British thing, but it's still the case here, you know, like these ways of creating power and hierarchies and ways of thinking, particularly binary ways of thinking, which I think are deeply colonial / patriarchal ways of thinking, are all taught us from a very early age, and we practice them on each other. And that's deeply damaging. I think it's destroying so many things in the world, you know, beginning with the environment. And here we are, and we have to recognize it if we're going to have, within ourselves is what I mean, if we're going to have any hope of undoing it.
I'm just looking at what Bianca wrote in the chat, but that is for later. So there's a point I wanted to really talk about that I'm really interested in. So you know, have written poetry, you've written across all different genres, and this book kind of is a lyrical braided essay, non-fiction sort of thing.
That's what it is.
I just wanted to hear your thoughts about the poetics, I guess, of nonfiction, because when a lot of people think of nonfiction, and especially, you know, before I got introduced to creative nonfiction, I thought nonfiction was like the Dewey Decimal System bit of the library. It was the encyclopedia, or like someone wrote a book about, I don't know, the Amazon rainforest, and I thought that was nonfiction. But obviously there's a whole different area of nonfiction that's become I don't want to say popular, but it's more, the word I'm coming back to is popular. It's more widespread now, like you see it.
More. I mean, you know, there's always been like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, he wrote this thing called Biographia Literaria. I've got that wrong, I'm almost sure, but which is basically him rambling on about his childhood and poetry, and it's a very maybe one of the first pieces of really major piece of romantic criticism, but he talks about all sorts of things. And so it's a form that's been around for a long time, essaying, but I think in the last maybe 20 years people have been playing with it a lot more. And there were books that really inspired me in wanting to approach monsters. One of them was Gillian Rose's Love's Work, which is she's a philosopher, and she wrote, I mean, it's an extraordinary book, but she wrote it when she was dying of ovarian cancer, and it's kind of a searing book about her family, which she's Jacqueline Rose's sister, if you know who Jacqueline Rose is. And it's I think that within her own family it's not they didn't love it a lot, but it's an incredible book. Or a book like H is for Hawk, which Helen Macdonald's book which is about grief but also taming a hawk. So it's a way of materially thinking about something, because all these things that bothered me about colonialism, about my family history, but like personally, but also much more broadly, about questions about culpability, shame, and pain, all those things. It's very easy to kind of talk about these things in abstract ways, and I think I wanted to write something that showed how materially embedded in lives these issues actually are, because they shape our lives. They shape your life as much as my life, but in different ways, these aspects of power. And a lot of the shaping is damage, and trying to kind of look at what that damage is in a way. I mean, it was an extraordinarily difficult book to write. It was much more difficult than I expected. I thought it would be okay because I've sort of looked at some of these things in poems and so on. This was really hard, but in different ways I didn't expect. So I did write it like I might write a poem, and the connections that are made in it are perhaps more poetic than anything else, like how I move from one idea to the next, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It does.
Well, it makes sense to me.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Answering my personal question. You talk about writing about family being, and families not being impressed with what they've written about, what has been written about them. Was it difficult for you to, because I guess your sister and your relationship breaking down is a big part of the book. Was it difficult to figure out what bits to leave in, what bits to leave out? Did you ask any of your other family members to read it before it went to print?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was difficult. I mean, given how difficult my relationship with my sister was, there was going to be no good outcome of writing the book. And I asked myself questions in the book when I was writing it, but also beyond that. And there's been, in terms of personal things, there's been good outcomes and bad outcomes. There's been family members who've told me how it's been a bit liberatory for them from certain patterns that they see. And there's also been a terrible amount of difficult conflict, as might be expected. And I just feel bad about that in terms of how that's affected other people. If it only affected me, then that would be kind of fair enough.
So relationships between other people have been affected.
Well, other people taking the flack that should properly have been directed towards me, more like that.
Yeah.
So that feels unfair.
But I guess what what happens after a book is released, you can't really control it anymore. It doesn't.
No, and it's either you write the book or you don't write it. And I decided to write it. I think I don't think there's any kind of easy way around it. Like either you say the things that you need to say or that you feel. I mean, for me, this book felt more important than just about the family, the things that I wanted to talk about. It was a way of talking about them that perhaps might bring some things together, that might make some things clearer for some people. That's always the hope. And that seemed important to me beyond whatever I felt about it or whatever. But it doesn't mean it's like, no, it was a difficult book. And when I worked with a really good editor. It's the only book I've ever written where from the start, it was like, right, I need to have an editor working with me. Usually I write a book first and then I work with an editor. This one, it was like, no, I need someone there who I can who can help me through the chaos of thought that's around it. And
because it's such a big sort of idea that you try to compress into something digestible as well as
and it's also very hard to be outside. It's still a book I find quite hard to think about. Like I can think about other books I've written. I can just think about them kind of almost objectively. This book, I still find it quite hard to think outside.
Do you think because it's so personal or because of the scope of it, or both?
I think it's a bit of both, actually, because there are lots of things I'm trying to kind of think through.
Yeah. You said it was liberatory. I don't know.
I think that'll do.
That word for a lot of your family members. Was writing it. Did it feel the same for you? Did it feel even slightly liberating to kind of put the words out there, or was it just difficult to write?
It felt. I mean, I got to the end and I thought, I know what I'm doing. This book is a spell, and which might sound odd, but it isn't really. It's where I ended up. And I do think I'm enough of a poet to think that writing is about making a spell of some kind. In some way, you're working on reality, and the spell really is about wanting to lift a curse. So I hope, in some ways it's worked. I mean, it's for me. I quote John Berger in there saying, "The naming of the intolerable is itself the hope," and it was really, very definitely me trying to do that, and name the intolerable. So that's what it is, and I suppose part of the thickets in it is just trying to find a way through the kinds of delusions we live among and in, and to something that isn't deluded.
That's quite difficult, though.
Tell me about it. It is less deluded, let's be modest, but that perhaps gives us or gives me even a way that's just a little light somewhere.
Do you think you'll come back to it maybe like 10, 20 years time and find new things to reflect on?
I have no idea. No idea.
That's a weird question.
I know it was the best I could do at the time.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, as I was writing it, it was like, I have to get it right this time, so I never have to write this book again. I mean, it's part of what was going on with me, but and I hope I never have to. I hope I can write other things and think other things. But we'll see.
But it's such a damning indictment of whiteness and colonialism in general that centuries have gone by and here we are still doing the same things.
And still
not
reproducing
really questioning them.
Yeah. I think that's what troubles me, is the constant reproduction of these same patterns, and how do we stop that? Yeah,
I think the young people younger than me have got some sort of grip on it, I hope.
some of them have, some of them definitely have. Others are more conservative. And
oh, reading a chat. Okay, last call for questions, guys, just in case you're not reading the chat. So if you want to send a question to either Alison or me, maybe just Alison, send them through to Bianca, because she'll be screening them for us. Any last words you'd like to say about the book? What is on my list? I think we've talked through everything on my list.
We've been very thorough. I mean, there's this thing that there's a wonderful writer called Singh, who you might follow on Twitter, I'm not sure, but she's she's Indian British, and a journalist and a teacher, and fairly extraordinary. And a conversation I had with her where from a beautiful essay she wrote about the woundedness of colonization, basically, and how do you find a way through these broken histories to being, how do you find a way to relate to others in some honest way, and how can we just be in this world given what shaped us? And we had a conversation about that, because she's coming from the other side, but we talked about it, saying that, like almost trying to get to a place from different areas. Her people were colonized, mine were the colonizers, but we still have the same kind of broken histories.
For sure.
We're, I think I call it a damage of privilege, but and it's definitely a trauma, experienced as trauma. But as I said in the book, I hesitate to claim that, because there's so much worse trauma that was inflicted by, my family, among other people. But that exists, and I think we really have to understand that as white people, that it's actively damaging us, and it's not understood in that way.
I think it's interesting for migrants and immigrants as well. My parents came here from their native countries, but they wouldn't have been able to do that if the colonization hadn't happened. And so it becomes much deeper and more complicated, I think, for second generation migrants, or people like that, where you understand that your ancestors weren't involved, but you still have, Chinese people don't get incarcerated at the rates that Indigenous people get incarcerated at. Like there's layers of privilege there that
and you're still colonizing this place. And I mean, I suppose one of the other things the book argues for is complexity. This is why I don't like guilt, or simple kind of you're bad, you're good, those kinds of binaries, and try to resist them, because they're complicated. It's complicated. There's no simple answer. And it's like you have to get up every day and think, just how do you deal with the day? Is it that level? How will I not be a colonizer today? And sometimes you fail. Often you fail.
It should be like a badge or something.
Remember not to colonize today.
I think that would make the perfect segue to our Q&A at the moment. We've had several questions and a few comments come through. So I just want to make sure we give everyone sort of enough time to be able to sort of give the space and time for their answers for you, Alison. Are you okay if I start reading out the questions?
Sure.
Or, yeah, wonderful. Thank you. It's been a most fascinating discussion. First question we received is from Jacqueline, and she says, I understand that memoirs are intended to answer poignant questions about who we are and how our experiences have shaped us. After reading Monsters, I felt that there were more questions asked than answered. Did you find the same, or did this process resolve or answer a lot of your questions?
I think, oh, sorry, I've missed who asked that, but
Jacqueline.
Hi, Jacqueline. No, it didn't. I've never been a writer who's particularly interested in answers, to be quite honest. So it definitely, for me, the memoir was a process of moving from kind of, the beginning is just a description of pain, which is the moment when I understood I no longer wanted to have a relationship with my sister, and the end is a recognition of pain. And the whole movement of the book is just simply a recognition that actually in that pain is love, that which is very difficult to understand, even though I will not talk to my sister again. I think that's fair to say. It doesn't mean I don't love her. And that's difficult. It'd be much easier if I didn't. So that's the movement of the book, and everything else is, but in the end, the book is about love. But that's not a question or an answer.
It's very poetic.
Yes.
I think too, it's important to be asking questions and not always offering resolutions, and particularly if we're writing close to, real life. It's not fictionalizing sort of the emotion and the truth of the work. So I'll move on to our next question from Megan, which she says, I've only just started reading your book, so this may be covered extensively in Monsters, but could you please elaborate on how white male dominance / power is reflected or internalized in relationships between women and sisters?
Okay. That is actually a major question in the book. And in that in particular, there's a lot of observation, but I drew a lot from women of color, writing about how white women weaponize vulnerability, and particularly against women of color, but also from how we do it to each other. It was a primary experience at school, and that comes out of again, it's complex, and this isn't going to be answered in any quick way, but what we're, as women, we're in a patriarchy. We internalize that we're second class, which was something that I rejected, which meant as a young woman rejecting my femininity, which I definitely rejected because my mother was always telling me that I had to be feminine, which is still a word I just wince at a bit, and which means rejecting who I am, like my actual physical body. I'm a cis woman, and what does that do to yourself? That you associate that with powerlessness, with being second class. And what does that do when you look at other women? You look at other women with that same internalized judgment. And so this can lead to the most, competitiveness in particular, I suppose, that women feel they must compete for male attention, all the things we know. they're all well documented and well experienced, I think, by every woman here. But all the negative things about how relationships between women can be shaped by internalized misogynies and external misogynies. It doesn't have to be that way, but it does happen. But we have to find our ways past them.
Thank you. That was a really comprehensive and very elaborate answer. Thank you. I appreciated that from my perspective as well, because when the question was posed, I was really like, ooh, how's this going to be answered? So thank you, Alison. And Felicity would like to hear about, so switching to more of a writerly question, which I love, would like to hear about your daily writing habits, how, where, when, how much, etc.
Okay, well, here it's my study, so which you get to see because which you wouldn't if I'd flown up to Brisbane this morning. But yeah, I write in here. I've had a workroom. I used to write when I started writing seriously after I had my first baby. I was always a writer, but I started really seriously writing when I had my first baby when I was 25. And everyone said, that's the end of a promising young poet. I was like, no, damn you. So I nearly killed myself. But I used to write on the kitchen table or in my bedroom. And then my partner, now my husband at the time, came along and he was like, why don't you have a study? And he made me build a study or, set aside a room with a desk. And it took me like 6 months to move into it. But I find, I was still writing on the kitchen table because I was too frightened in my study. But anyway, I now inhabit it and it's where I work. I don't work in cafes. And when I'm writing, and it depends, it changes all the time. But if I'm writing a book, or it used to be, I've got a job now, so I'm working 3 days a week. No, it's fine. But I used to, if I had a book, I'd just decide at some point, I'd have the idea, I'd probably have written a bit. And then at some point it would be like, right, Monday, I'm going to start. And then I just do the, X number of words a day, averaged out over a fortnight. I write them. I'm writing a book at the moment, actually. I could show you. I write it, all the page numbers, the word count in, because it makes me feel like I'm doing something. And I do that religiously every working day.
And is that something you work towards, like you set yourself a goal of X amount of words per day, or is it more something you're tracking, going, okay, I wrote this much on this day?
Once I'm decided I've working on a book, I usually do some maths, and I think, this book is going to be 300 pages. It will take me this long. And every book, some books are 500 words a day, and some are 2,000. It seems to vary with the book and the kind of book it is, but I try to work out a weekly goal and then stick to it, because otherwise I don't get it done. It's just that banal. And then I write them in the book.
I could keep asking writing questions, but I don't want to take over the Q&A or your conversation there, Yen-Rong, as well. I find it fascinating. I will just go to a comment that we've had from Michael, who interestingly has read the book and found quite a connection to it, and I'll explain why. He said, Alison, my mother's ancestors were some of the Norman settlers referred to, and he gives page 34.
Right.
Also, a many greats uncle worked for the East India Company around 1800 for 20 years, came home able to afford the best house in town. He had a reputation as an honourable man.
Yeah.
So if you had any sort of, comment on that?
Sounds very familiar. They're all honourable men, and probably by their own lights were honourable men.
So I'll go back to you, Yen-Rong. I'll just keep an eye on the chat. If any questions do come through, we've got maybe time for one more or so. But if you had any sort of final questions or whatnot, and maybe, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, your 200 words a day. But I found that really inspiring.
Bianca and Alison and I were talking before before this started, about momentum and writing, and I mentioned that because I work a full-time job, and before this job I worked 3 jobs, so I would set myself 200 words a day, and do the 200 words. If it was a good day, I would do more, but if it wasn't, if it was like 2 hours to get those 200 words out, then I'd do those 2 hours and then go do whatever else I needed to do. There were some times where I had to, not that many times, but there were some times where I had to tell myself, no dinner until you finish the 200 words, like a mother.
Yep.
And sometimes it was like 10 o'clock, so then I went and got macca's.
Yeah, that's a bad day. I mean, when I was the first novels I wrote, and I was shocked when I wrote them because they were fantasy novels. When I was 40, I came out of the closet as a secret fantasy writer, but I love writing fantasy. And the first things I wrote were epic fantasy books, which are 500 pages long. As a poet who'd never written more than 10 pages, this was quite a shock to me, but I did it. Like, wow, I did 5 of them. And so
good. I read them when I was a teenager.
Did you?
I did.
But yes, it was a bit of a shock. And that was really, some days, they were 2,000 word a day books. So a good day, I could get up, be done by 10 o'clock, rest of the day off, I go and, play video games, which is what I usually do when I'm writing. And bad days, I'd be there at 10 o'clock, still struggling away. But that's why I average it out over a fortnight, actually. 5 days a week. I'm very thin about days off. You have to have days off, but 5 days a week over a fortnight, and you have to account for those bad days. So some days you cannot write. It's the worst, most terrible, awful feeling, where it's just like pulling teeth.
Yeah, when I was doing my thesis, Kim Wilkins, who is a lecturer at UQ, I did 500 words a day when I was writing my thesis, but she had this like bingo card, and with just different numbers in the squares, and then you got a freebie in the middle, I think. And so every day you'd like pick a square and cross that off. And then when you completed a line, you got the next day off.
Good. Bribery is very important.
Yeah.
I mean, I bribe myself constantly. I mean, at the moment, this book I'm working on, which I'm a bit behind on, luckily it's a short book, but so I've been doing 3,000 word days. I took 2 weeks off because of the momentum thing, and I'm now on. I'll finish it, but it's exhausting.
It's a lot of thinking.
Yeah, it is, but it's kind of weird thinking. It's not like thinking when I'm trying to write a review or a piece of criticism. It's a different kind of thinking that ends up making me feel exhausted and physically bruised. Like, if I just can't work out how that happens, but I had a couple of days last week where I just felt like I was bruised all over, and I've just been sitting at the desk all day. Like, why do you feel like that? It's exhausting in a really strange, weird way that makes zero sense, except that maybe you're just pulling on, particularly at writing at that pace, I think you're pulling on your subconscious quite a lot, and it's paying you back, maybe. I don't know.
Let us know when you finish.
Maybe it did work out okay that you sort of, you're able to still be here for this launch tonight with us, and also have a little bit of rest and not so much of the up and down and the plane travel and everything. So we have unfortunately reached our time, although as usual, this goes way too quickly, and I just want to keep asking questions. It's like momentum you get when you're writing. You sort of just go, okay, no, well, this is the conversation sort of thing. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. I just wanted to ask before, just to talking about sort of finding out a bit more about you both as writers. Are you okay if I pass on your websites, the URLs to your websites so people can find out a
Absolutely.
bit more?
Yeah, that's
Wonderful.
fine.
Just like to check.
It's
Thank
on my
you.
website.
No, it's wonderful. That's why I check them out. I'm like, I'm signing up to the newsletter. This is fantastic. You
Bring
get a
Alice
free
to the
story.
newsletter.
So, like I said, that does bring us to the end of the launch event. However, you can definitely go online to Avid Reader. They are prolific with their events. So please do hop onto our events page, find out, and whether it's online, in person. We're doing a bit of both at the moment, so be sure to check those out. Please support our independent bookstores and our wonderful Australian writers as well by purchasing their books. As I said, I've sent the link through tonight in the chat, so just follow those. And I think that's all I need to say. We've had a couple of comments from Rebecca. She says, thank you so much for this evening. I'm so happy that it went ahead regardless of lockdown. So us too. And we've had a few wows and thank yous along the way too. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll now allow you to, or you should be able to unmute yourselves, and we can join in thanking Alison and Yen-Rong with a big Avid Reader round of applause. So send you out with a bang. Thank you both very, very much.
It's been a complete pleasure.
From the cat.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and we hope you'll join us again. Good night.
Good night.
Bye. Pleasure to meet you both.
Yeah, likewise. It was.
What?
It's